6 years ago. I do a lot of the technical stuff for Eureka, and explore a lot of caves and do canyoneering and all kinds of other stuff in my free time. I kind of got into caving when I was in the Southeast, and I also spent some time in Austin, Texas, where there's a big cave scene, particularly that goes to Mexico because it's so close. And yeah, really fell in love with it. And unfortunately, the caves out here are a little weak, not very big, not very extensive because we don't have a lot of limestone. But fortunately, I still have friends back in Texas, so we go to Mexico 2 or 3 times a year to see what we can see. And so this is kind of, there's really, I guess, 6 parts to this, two main sections, and I've split them each into 3 pieces each. So I mean, getting there, because getting to Mexico is kind of, it's almost half the battle. Finding the caves, because they are unmapped caves, no one knows where they are. The whole point is to go out there and find new ones. Actually getting to the cave, because as you'll soon see, it's not just a hike in the woods. And then once you're in the cave, there's a lot of stuff that goes into getting to the bottom of the cave, because they're quite deep. So yeah, getting to Mexico, and it's really, each day you're getting there is about a day and a half each way when you leave from Central Texas. So from Colorado, you really have an extra kind of half day at least just to get to Central Texas. And we typically drive, because really where we're going, no one would rent us a car, even if we could rent a car, because it's pretty far back there, and you definitely beat these vehicles up a fair bit. And so you can see in this picture right here that there is a truck, and that's on what we're going to call a road, and that's kind of how all of these start. So yeah, typically we drive down to the border the evening before, and then camp on the U.S. side of the border, because you want to get to the border as soon as possible. This is trying to cross the border the same evening you drive down there, and it's a mess. Everyone's trying to do it. It's a pretty popular border, and so you want to go as early as possible in the morning, because it'll get backlogged pretty quick. And then unfortunately, also, it's still northern Mexico, so there's still a lot of cartel violence there. And so this is a cartel truck that got shot up a few minutes, it was like 20 or 30 minutes after we passed through town. And you want to make sure that you travel during the day, because daylight violence is pretty uncommon there. And this isn't my photo, this is just from the news. But it still does happen. So you really want to give yourself as much time as possible to get through the paved part of Mexico and into the backcountry with daylight. Also, once you get in Mexico, you have to buy the groceries, because you don't take them across the border because it's cheaper down there. And so once we've gotten to Mexico and we get the groceries and we finally get off the road, we go through and spend countless hours, like 4 or 5 hours, driving on rough 4x4 ranch roads. Really, it's most of the day. And the Texas cavers have long-standing relations with Mexican ranch owners. So we have keys to navigate through this, but there's a system of gates, because you go 100 miles back there, and it's all different parcels of land with different owners. And so you have to open and close gates, and there's a whole politics just navigating landowner relations to get to where we're going. And so it takes, like I said, about a few hours just to get to where we're going. And oftentimes there's abandoned buildings there from ranch, old ranch hands, or just we'll camp somewhere where we happen to find an abandoned building. And so here's an abandoned ranch house that we stayed in. And typically they've been there for a while. They've been abandoned for a while. This one was abandoned, I think, sometime in the 80s, early 90s. And so I don't know when Pan Am went out of business, but I know that it was quite a while ago. And so this was just found inside there. There's old pictures of the people who used to live there, and just remnants of the house. And honestly, that's kind of one of the more interesting parts about it, is just going through and finding some of the history of these old ranches that have just been abandoned as they kind of got consolidated. And then some of them, sometimes it's substantially nicer. This was an abandoned hotel, and this was like the dining room. And so obviously this one was pretty deluxe. It came with even a kitchen, and we just had to bring water, and we always have to bring water to Mexico anyway. So, I mean, this was a kitchen with almost running water, it had running septic, so at least we could drain out stuff there. But then sometimes it's not so nice. Sometimes they're just literally abandoned buildings that have roofs caved in, and it's just a flat place to sleep that isn't surrounded by spiky plants. And so we typically go in fall and winter when it's not too hot, but sometimes it'll get cold, which is why there's a little fire burning here in the fireplace, because sometimes in the desert it'll get pretty cold, even though we're that far south. In winter it still gets into the 30s at night, and it's definitely uncomfortable. And then sometimes we just find things out in the middle of absolute nowhere, even in the middle of nowhere for being in the middle of nowhere, and have no real idea of how it got there or why. And so this is an abandoned chapel. And the best guess we had was that there was evidence of previous mining activity there quite some time ago. And so, as you can tell, there's really nothing else in this entire valley. This chapel is just up on a hill, and our best guess is that the miners built it back when there was a mine there. And so once we actually get to base camp, the next big hurdle is finding the caves. And that can be a whole other challenge in itself. And so while here in the US we have 1 to 24,000 scale maps, which are, for the whole country, which are pretty good for navigation. The best publicly and widely available ones through Mexico are about 1 to 50,000, like what you see here. And so these are pretty good for navigating around to to camp and to get up and over mountains, but it doesn't help find the caves much because it's just too broad. So the the old school way of doing it, which is what we have to do when we're in Mexico, is stereo pairs. And they essentially use 2 offset aerial images to produce a 3D effect to allow you to perceive depth. And so like larger caves become readily apparent, and you can even kind of spot smaller entrances, but you are limited by the resolution of the images. And sometimes when you look at a black spot on the image, you get excited because you think it's going to be a cave entrance, but it turns out it was just a black bear that was walking across when they took that picture. And you get there and there's nothing remotely at all like a cave there. And it's a little disappointing. Mexican aerial imagery is available for much of the country, but it's not really all that great. And you have to request physical copies from the Mexican capitals. Like you have to write them and say like, hey, I'd like you to send me these exact photos for this area. And then you have to send them some money because they have to print out copies and then mail you physical copies of them. And so it's super tedious. And then even once you have the stereo pairs and you go through and you locate everything that you're interested in, it's not just like on Google Maps where you can click it and say, oh, here are the coordinates. If you locate it on the image, you then have to then translate that location to where it is on the map and then enter it into the computer and to be able to find it. And so it's a long process to use stereo pairs, but it's kind of the best that we have because the other LiDAR and other advanced geospatial imaging isn't available for just the middle of the desert in northern Mexico. At least not available to us. Probably the military and the cartels have it or something, but we don't. And so some of you will probably be familiar with this concept where you print out 2 images side by side and you look at them with these stereo pair glasses. And this is how you do it when you deal with physical photographs. It's definitely pretty old school. And using digital imagery, you can generate 3D terrain models, but again, we have all these old paper photos, and it's no small task to convert paper photos to digital files that are properly georeferenced, so you can just import them into geospatial software. And so while this method is slow and it definitely yields inconsistent results, it's the best that we have right now. And additionally, it's something that you can do from the comfort of your own home. You don't have to wait until you're in Mexico to go around and walk looking for caves, because you can order a bunch of stereo pairs and sit at your dinner table and go through and say, oh, that looks like a cave, and mark it down. And so that on the next trip, you have a whole bunch of them you can see at once. Past that, sometimes we get lucky and there are way easier ways of finding caves, and we just ask the ranch hands. Most of this land is still used for cattle farming. And so like we ran into these guys in this picture on the way, and we just asked them, where are the caves? And they took us to where they had to put up fences to stop the cows from falling in, because some of these caves do get pretty big and the cows just kind of wander in or they wash in because it flash floods. And so that makes it easy, because if there's a fence there so the cows don't fall in. We at least know it's big enough and deep enough that the cows fall in and can't get out. And so we explored those ones, and yes, there were many cow bones at the bottom. So the cows do indeed wash into the caves. And that's actually even something we had to deal with in the Southeast, because in Alabama, there can be 5,000 caves in a square mile and you don't know about it. And so we'll oftentimes, even in the Southeast, find cow or deer bones that have been, from an animal that's fallen into a cave and just died there. So once we have an idea of where the cave is, we still have to get there. And again, it might sound like, oh, well, that's easy. Like, if you know where it is, how hard can it really be? But no, more often than not, we have no real idea where the cave is, and we have to karst walk. And that means we split into groups and comb the surface relentlessly for hours, just kind of hoping that we'll find something. And it's called karst walking because, well, we're walking through karst. And karst is defined as a landscape underlain by limestone, which has been eroded by dissolution, producing ridges, towers, fissures, sinkholes, and other characteristic landforms. Oddly enough, the internet definition does not include caves, but caves are very typical. In fact, they are kind of the hallmark of karst. And really, you can't have karst without caves. And we don't have a lot of karst around here, but it looks a lot like this rock in the bottom left. It's limestone. If you've driven through Glenwood Canyon, which I'm sure probably all of us have, you see a lot of limestone. And so we have, caves in Glenwood Canyon. There's Glenwood Caverns, or whatever that show cave is there. And there's a few wild caves in White River National Forest, but there's not really enough limestone to make very deep caves or super geologically interesting caves. But you might think that karst walking sounds like hiking, and you just walk around and look for caves. But hiking through these plants is not as nice as it may seem. Pretty much getting anywhere involves brittle, spiky plants. This is a video. I don't know why it's not playing. Oop. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to stream a video, but it was a video of me hacking through a prickly pear because one of these was just so choked with prickly pear. There was really no way getting in and out. We're just gonna have that. There we go. Let's see if it will play. Well, that was a good thought. Anyway, so you can just imagine I had a machete there and I was cutting that plant apart. And prickly pears, at least the top of them, is nice and soft and fleshy and it cuts easily. Once you get towards the bottom, it turns into an actual tree, and it gets very difficult to walk through, and it still has all the fun spikes that we all know and love. And so then you have more plants that are spiky, like these things. I think this is mesquite, maybe. I don't know. There's a whole different subset of plants, and I'm not a plant guy, but a whole different subset of plants that I learned about that really live in the desert and hate you. And so these things really make our desert look kind of hospitable, because no matter what you wear, these thorns will come out of your skin for the next week, 2 weeks even. These things, they're mean plants. And so to avoid as much bushwhacking as possible, we tried to drive from camp to as close to the destination as we can get. And Mexican maps had this, what you see in this picture, labeled as a road, but it's pretty clear that it's no longer a road. It's kind of just a cow path at this point. And this is another video if it would play, but we might just have to imagine. Yeah. Anyway, you can imagine a truck just driving clean through all of these bushes, because that's essentially what it is. There was zero road there. Well, there, at least to change perspective. No real road to speak of, but the map says that it was a road, so we tried it. It was largely a fail. So then even when you arrive at the cave entrance, it can still kind of be underwhelming, because this is what the cave entrance looks like. So after you spend 3 days walking through deep spikes and pulling them out of your arms, you arrive at a small little 4 foot by 4 foot hole in the ground, and it just doesn't look like much. But what this actually does is it goes 850 feet down into the earth, and it eventually ends at the aquifer, which is pretty important. It's particularly important for caves in this region because it's the desert, and so if you can get all the way down to the aquifer, then at least you know that you've reached that level. And if you can connect several caves that go down to the aquifer, you can start to form a system and say like, okay, well, these bolts go down to the aquifer, so it's very likely that then they're connected by a flooded water cave that you then have to dive. So then once you arrive at the cave, these caves are totally unexplored. They have no bolts, no rope in place. So we have to bring a lot of ropes, a lot of bolts, drills, batteries, all kinds of stuff to explore the cave, because there is nothing in place and there's no guarantee of any sort of safety for it. So basically you start by fixing a rope at the top of the cave, so either to a tree or a rock or whatever you have, and then rappel with a drill, bolts, and a rope, and you start going down. And once you reach the end of the rope, if you're not on the ground, you construct a rebelay. And this is essentially a station where fellow cavers can change from one rope to the next, because if the cave goes down 800 feet, we can't carry just 800 straight feet of rope, because that's too much for one person to carry and it's too bulky. So we'll bring 4 200-foot sections, and you rappel 200 feet, you'll drill these bolts, and then you rappel another 200 feet and drill more bolts, and so on and so forth. And so at these stations, you can change from one rope to the next. And so most often you have to bring a drill and place new bolts for the next rappel. But sometimes you can use natural features and just kind of sling them, and you can save time and equipment. And so here we've slung this piece of flowstone, and you just rappel down to that and switch ropes pretty easily. But no matter how it's done, it's critical that the anchor of the rope is stable and doesn't rub excessively against the rock. Because as you're ascending, you cause the rope to expand and contract a lot. It's kind of like bouncing, like as you push up, and as you bounce, you just cause it to rub so much. And if you're not careful with the rope placement, you can pretty easily wear through it. And so the rope in this image was just from 7 people ascending, which is not a lot. Rope is obviously supposed to last far longer than just 7 people. But we've already worn through a good chunk of this rope, and it's obviously not suitable for use anymore. And so this is just an image of people rigging from above. You can see that there's some red webbing there, as it's got one slung feature, and then I think off to the left it's another slung feature. So this was using just slung features instead of bolts because it's substantially faster. Because rigging can be pretty slow. It takes around 45 minutes to an hour or so to rig each drop. And so if you're going to go down 800 feet and it's going to be 4 200-foot sections, which it almost never is that clean, that's about 4 hours. And carrying all this rope into the cave, of course, can get awkward, especially in tight sections. So you can see that right there is about 250 feet of rope, and that'll weigh like 15 pounds or so, and it gets pretty big, pretty bulky. And if you have to carry it through a tight canyon passage or something like that, you can tell pretty quickly that you don't want to carry 800 feet of rope at once. So you kind of have to split it up. And so we're not in the cave just to explore for fun and bop it and go home. We do surveys. And these surveys are used by people who study the desert hydrology and various aspects of desert hydrology, geology, and as you'll hear later a bit about the biology of the creatures and the caves and the nature of the desert in northern Mexico. And in order for that to be useful, we can't just show up and say, oh yeah, we went there, it's about 800 feet deep. They have to have an actual map of the cave. And so this is a picture of a cave map that was made on a recent trip. And while they might look like it's just kind of a simple little drawing, boy, those things, a lot of time goes into making a properly made cave map, and it's difficult. Tape and compass surveys are the old school way of doing it, but the concept kind of remains, so it's the easiest way to conceptualize. They're still used in some scenarios even, especially in cave diving, where like laser-based instruments won't work because it's underwater. But the survey works the same way that you'd make a survey on land or a map on land. You start at one point, and then you measure azimuth and distance from that point to your next point, and then to the next point, and then to the next point, and so on. And as you proceed through the cave, you take notes such as like the estimation of the cave height. If you can't tell, usually the roof is so far above your head, you can't really tell, at least you hope it's so far above your head, you can't tell. Cave height, cave formations, the slope of the floor, and so on. And so that as you go through, you have your lines and you note things along the lines as you go, and you can create cross sections based on those. And modern tools allows pretty much to do the same thing, but substantially faster. So here you can see this thing is called a Disto X, and there's a modification you can make out of the box. It doesn't have a compass in it, but there's a modification you can make to it to add a compass, and it will do inclination, bearing, and distance all in one. So you just press the button, it shoots the laser, and it gives you all of them. And it'll save the points in the device so that you can just tell right off the bat. And these are substantially faster, but it still takes time because you have to sit there and you have to mark the station where you were, usually with a little like a paint pen, and then flag it so that you know exactly where it was that you surveyed it in case you have to go back and resurvey. And if you do either disto or a tape and compass survey, either way you end up with more or less the same result. On the left here is what you sketch as you go. And on the right is a similar thing that you'll get if you use Disto, because you can link it to your phone, and there are apps on your phone that will turn it into this nice quick survey you see here. So it's substantially faster and more accurate to use the electric or the digital tools, but they are definitely more costly. And they have their own limitations, such as battery life, and if it's too misty in the cave, the laser doesn't really get a proper reading or anything like that. But for the most part, the caves in northern Mexico are pretty dry, so the laser-based tools are pretty solid. And then with either of these sketches, you can go through and scan them and improve them using computer software to make the map much more professional and easier to read. And these are two examples of just professionally award-winning maps. They're still, they look much better than the original ones, than the rough draft, but it's still very difficult to actually navigate in cave using these because it just doesn't really look the same when it's in the dark and you can't really see. The survey teams, of course, go along inch by inch and spend a lot of time in there, but when you're walking through the cave, it's easy to miss things that are very obviously on the map. And so this is from a cave in northern Mexico. This is my friend Galen sketching next to some flowstone. And so you sit there and you draw up all the details. And this is the bottom of a pit. So you have to visualize space in 3D that he's at 200 feet down on a little ledge next to a 600-foot drop, and then measure, the width of the ledge, and a bunch of other features about this, and the fact that it's got rocks there, and that the formation type is slowstone, and so a lot goes into it. And you can kind of faintly make out at the bottom of this pit. He's actually not at the bottom, he's on rope where the pit makes a curve. That sketching on rope is pretty difficult, but there's a little sketchbook down there, that orange sketchbook with white pages. And sketching on rope can just be really difficult. So sometimes you find things you don't expect, and sometimes things just don't go according to plan. And this is kind of the fun part of it. But here is the bottom. I'm at the bottom of a cave in northern Mexico, bundled up because one of our partners got stuck on rope about halfway up a 1,200-foot exit. And so we had to spend an unexpected night in the cave with kind of no food and little to keep us warm. And typically it's not too cold in the caves, especially in northern Mexico. But if it's 60 degrees and you're sitting there for 10 hours, it gets chilly enough. Sometimes you get surprised by beautiful formations. This is a bunch of flowstone and curtains that have formed up here. And this is kind of atypical for Mexican caves just because the lack of water. You need water to make these beautiful formations. And so, sometimes you get surprised and they're more beautiful than you'd expect. Sometimes you find these things, like this is I don't know what this skull is. Hopefully someone else would be able to tell me. There were bears in the area, so maybe it's a bear, but it doesn't look like much of a bear to me. I don't know. But we are pretty far back in this cave. I mean, it must have been probably 500 feet back of a horizontal cave, and found this skull and then pieces of the rest of some other animal. It's a fair-sized skull, but I guess it would be a little small to be a bear. Maybe it's a coyote. So find stuff like that. A blind catfish. And so this is from the cave that I was talking about before that went 850 feet down to the aquifer. we know it was the aquifer because there's a blind catfish there, and blind catfish are an endangered species of fish that only live in certain regions. I guess there's different species that live in different regions, but this one only lives in like northern Mexico and southern Texas. And it's a species of catfish that is adapted to live in caves, and as such, it just doesn't have eyes. And it really flourishes in the aquifer. And so when you see the blind catfish, since they're so rare, you can have a good idea that this cave that we had reached, in fact, the aquifer. It wasn't just pooling water down there at 850 feet. It was the actual aquifer. And since there was a blind catfish there, it strongly indicates that this cave connects to other caves at that level, or at least connects to the aquifer. So any cave that reaches the aquifer will also be able to connect to this cave via cave diving. And then sometimes it's just a really pretty place. And so here we are working through a canyon section, just kind of waiting probably on sketchers, because sketching is the slowest part. You get to see cool stuff like this, you know, just on the way down into the cave. More on rappel. There aren't really that many pictures of sketching. I mostly because no one takes pictures of sketching, because it's kind of like the boring part. Sometimes it gets pretty narrow. This is my friend Galen coming out of a cave. And so he is, you know, it is as small as it can get. He's not a very big guy. He's probably about my size. And so that opening to get into that cave is about as small as it gets. You really have to wriggle through there. And this is kind of just to show how much rope you need. You can see, I think everyone here has at least 200 feet of rope on them, and we still have a lot of rope left in the truck, just because you need so much rope to explore. Because the worst thing that can happen, and this is what happened to us in our 850-foot cave, is that you run out of rope, and then you're just kind of bummed because you drove all the way down to Mexico and carried all this rope and battled all the cactus just to end up you know, going 850 feet down. And you're like, well, we could keep going if we had another 300 feet of rope. I guess it kind of bummed. It's a good problem to have. And so this is just another view of that 850-foot cave. This is maybe 150 feet in. And you can see down there where they're rigging on that same ledge that I showed earlier. From that drop, it goes down another 450 feet pretty much straight. And then it levels out and it goes up and over and then down all the way to the aquifer. I think this is the last picture. This is just a huge cave that we found unexpectedly. I don't know how we didn't see it on the aerial imagery. It's kind of at an angle with the slope in it. So it didn't have a very big signature from above. But as we were hiking, just a massive, massive sinkhole. I think it went down 300 feet, but it wasn't necessarily the depth that was impressive so much as just the sheer volume. All right, and that's it. That was 20 minutes. Any questions?
Mike, that's fascinating. Like, it seems like such a cool adventure.
It is pretty cool.
I'm curious, Mike, what other locations you've gone internationally through caves, or just Mexico?
Mostly just Mexico, let me think. I wandered into some in Thailand, because Thailand, of course, Southeast Asia has a lot of good caves, so the biggest in the world really in terms of volume. But I haven't gone on any actual expeditions there just because it's so far. It's very easy to go to Mexico for a week, but to go to Southeast Asia for a week, you have to deal with jet lag and getting all your stuff there. And the big advantage of Mexico really is that I can leave my ropes and stuff with friends or my sister in Austin, and I can fly to Austin and not have to carry all that stuff, because we go with truckloads full of stuff, because you need a drill, at least one drill, usually a drill and a backup, a bunch of drill bits, like 3 or 4 batteries, 800 feet of rope is kind of a minimum. Food for a week, water for a week, all your caving clothes, a bunch of machetes, spare tires because those roads are rough, bunch of food, camp stuff. You just need a lot of stuff. And so to go internationally, is more difficult. Really, the only reason that most Texas cavers go to Mexico is because the Texas caves are small and unimpressive.
Well, that was very impressive, and I learned a lot, and I wonder if your mother knows that you're doing this.
my mother even came on a caving trip with me in North Carolina, like 8 years ago. So she does indeed know.
Okay. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah.
Betty, I was thinking about the karst topography in the Everglades, and Janet, you spend half the year there too. So Mike, would underneath Florida, it would just be all the caves would be in the ocean underneath Florida, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I used to live in Gainesville, which is kind of cave country for Florida. But unfortunately, Gainesville is cave diving country. It's really kind of the capital of cave diving because Florida, obviously, you go down 10 feet and you're pretty much in the water. So it's not all the ocean. A lot of it is, the vast majority, I would say, is springs and freshwater. And so you can do a lot of cave diving in Florida, and there's a limited amount of dry caving, but for the most part, it is heavy duty, serious cave diving, and it's where people travel. I mean, there and like the Yucatan in Mexico are internationally renowned cave diving destinations.
Can you say again, what do you do with this data once you've mapped the cave?
So there's a Texas American Caving Association, TCMA. Anyway, there's an organization in Texas that stockpiles all this data, and then Mexican researchers use it alongside a bunch of hydrologists and geologists in UT Austin. They use it. I don't know exactly what for, but for various scientific purposes. I know that because it was published in. I don't know. I'd have to pull up one of the journals. But for a bunch of different things, because there's bats down there, and cave biology, cave geology, hydrogeology, especially in the deserts, is all kind of tied into caves.
I have a question. How many unmapped caves are there still available for you to explore? And I wonder how you choose which ones to explore.
Yeah, we don't really know how many unmapped caves there are because they're unmapped. But there's many.
Is there like a catalog of, or I mean, how do you find them, I guess is my question.
Yeah, you either have to walk around just looking for them, and so we'll record GPS tracks as we walk around to know where we've already walked, or you use the aerial imagery, or you
Sorry,
use
I missed that.
you either walk around and we record our GPS tracks so we know where we've walked, and so we know not to walk there again. It's literally just like a search party in the woods looking for just a hole in the ground, or you use the stereo pairs and that aerial imagery to try to spot what you can, which results seem kind of varied on that, but it's at least something you can do without being there in person in the heat and the spikes.
Yeah, the prickly pear looks pretty intense there. Are there any more questions for Mike? Keith and Kathy, you want to go on a cave exploring adventure?
No.
No for you, Benny.
Won't do it.
When I was a teenager, I was foolish, and we did a lot of stovepipe stuff. Just crawling around over by Cave of the Winds outside of Colorado Springs. There's some pretty, I don't know. Now I have a self-preservation sort of attitude now that I didn't have when I was 16 years old.
How about you, Randy? Have you had any cave experience?
I've only probably been in one cave in my life. Most of the time that I've been underground, it's been to go in mines. And mines are a little bit, I guess I like to think they're a little bit more dangerous or a little bit more scary because some of them are held up by timbers, They've been carved out by machinery that miners have used either in Central America or in North America, the ones I've been in. And when you carve out it mechanically, you haven't really, you got to pay attention. Is it going to fall? Whereas the natural caves have been eroded, dissolved, and then they have, as we saw, the kinds of precipitating sedimentary rocks, and they've been sitting there for quite a while. So in general, I think they're not quite as scary. And I've been in places where in mines, they drill a hole and they look for, is there any gold or silver, or copper, or whatever they're looking for down at the end of that core, because they don't want to go somewhere and spend all that time and all that money digging out things that are useless, that are just waste. So they drill a hole, and when they find something at the other end of the hole, then they make the narrowest possible pathway to get to where they can then mine out some ore material. So it's a little bit different, a little bit more interesting. And I've been in a lot of mines in Colorado.
Mike, have you ever gotten stuck? Like unable to come out because that one guy could like barely fit?
No, kind of getting pretty close. There have been times where you'd like stop and think about it for a second, breathe out, and like concentrate. But no, never gotten stuck. Nothing too bad.
Well, thanks for sharing with us today. I know there were folks who couldn't make it who will be looking forward to the recording, and we appreciate your time, Mike. That was I think we all learned a lot.
Cool. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Mike.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.